Well, this week we'll talk about Debussy's Wind on the Plain and a little bit about Book I and the placement of the preludes in Book I. It's interesting how he alternates various natural elements, as well as other themes that he valued so much. I've talked about this some before, but, for instance, we start with the Delphic Dancers, which was inspired by a vase he saw, of ancient Greece. Then, we have wall, sails, or mists, which deals with these very murky, abstract sounds and images. Then we have the third one, the wind on the plain. We have this melody, as well as this texture, it's like an ostinato, a warbling, this murmuring, we can imagine the rustling of the leaves, of the wind, of this subtle movement on the plain. It's possible it came from Paul Verlaine's song, C'est l'état, from 1887. It's possible that this is a reference to that. Then we go on, we have, the Baudelaire Harmonie du Soir, the sounds and scents turning in the evening air. So we've had, the wind element, the ostinato element, and then, this very evocative Baudelaire poem. Then after that, the Hills of Anacapri, which is a very, very vivid, I've never been to Anacapri in Italy, but apparently the colors are just very, very vivid and very bright. And it's quite a bright contrast to these. People, as I've mentioned before, people have said you shouldn't perform them as a cycle, but he very clearly put them together as a thoughtful cycle because they were composed at different times, and they don't appear in their chronological order of composition, which I think is interesting. So he put a lot of thought. There are times that perhaps you end in certain parts of the piano and then he continues. But there's also a thematic side of it as well. And then after the Hills of Anacapri, so bright, so flashes of color, so Italy. Then we go to Footsteps in the Snow. This very inward, lonely, isolated, existential piece, it's quite a very huge contrast to Anacapri. Then what the west wind saw, the element of the wind, comes back, and we have, it's a tempest though. It's not the murmuring on the plain. This is the big, huge image of wind, more like a hurricane or a tornado. And then we have the girl with the flaxen hair. A picture of simplicity, right? The girl with the hair and this quiet, innocent moment she's having, And then after that, we go on to this interrupted serenade, the bump bump, which is a much more cryptic kind of a piece, It's interrupted. What is he playing with there? Well, he's playing with time. He's playing with expectation. There's a bit of humor. Debussy apparently was great at telling jokes. So this is a whole other side of him that we haven't had in the preludes thus far. It also comes up later. If we think about the cakewalk things, the General Levine eccentric in the second book, some of these elements, music hall elements, it's another side of it, but really the interrupted serenade, how many preludes in are we? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We're 9 into it. So it's interesting he waited until then. And then after that, the Sunken Cathedral, which was inspired by that legend of the sunken town of Yi, that was submerged in the ocean and then rose. You know, it's we have. You know, talk about a grand image of mysticism, of myth, of story. You know, it's a whole other world that he's created. Then we go on to the Dance of Puck. You know, I mentioned humor and music hall and something lighter. And so with Puck, well, you know, Puck, Shakespeare had a Puck, right? You know, Puck was a comic figure that we had, you know, various parts of literature and time. You know, very mercurial, very changeable, also very abstract as you went on. I talked about it in one of the other talks, you know. But you see, he's really taking us on a journey through these. Then after the Dance of Puck, well, Minstrels is the last one in Book I. Minstrels is a complicated one because it's based on clowns that he saw on the promenade in Eastbourne. Of course, these clowns were in blackface, and that was something that happened at this part of the century all over the world, but particularly in France too. And so it's based on that. I think it's quite a good composition, but now is not probably the time to be focusing on it as much. But it's interesting he ends with that one, you know, which at that point would have been on an upbeat sort of a note, you know, a comical sort of a note. And boy, it ends actually with a plagal 4/5. Well, yeah, we go from a C to a G for the cadence, and that's an interesting thing as well. You know, he ends with a very traditional G major white key. It's in G major. Because throughout these, as I've mentioned in some of these discussions, you know, he deals with tonality, or he deals with allusions to tonality, or he completely abandons tonality, you know, as in La Terrasse last week. He answers chromaticism and Wagnerianism, ultrachromaticism, Schoenberg's 12-tone system, and Brahms' perfection of tonality with a completely different landscape that has tonal allusions but is really divorced and has its own language. Wind on the Plain, you know, is part of this process. It's in the middle of the process, I would say. It's more clusters. It's more, we have these. We have, and then we come back. There's a sense of motion harmonically with these fifths, but it's interesting they're open fifths, you know. Of course, they sound great on this Bösendorfer with the extra keys, don't they? Don't they sound great down there? So, and then we have in the middle section the G major, very splashy contrast. Then we have B major. I talked about in Wagner third related keys. Well, here they are: G major, B major, and then this time it's a G sharp. So this isn't functional tonality. This isn't 1-4-5-1. This is something different. Plus we have this murmuring of the wind. Well, that's whole tone, isn't it? Sounds very whole tone. And he ends, in fact, with the final. We have that dissonance of the C flat, of this half step. But then when the pedal comes out, we have the octave B flats, and then we finally have the B flat. What's interesting is that in the next one, the parfum, the turn of sounds and scents in the air, we have the B flat for parfum. We have the B flat. We go down a half step to A. So clearly he put these together with a sort of thematic harmonic thing as well, too, to end with the B flat. Then he takes us down. What does he do going from Parfum onto the Hills of Anacapri? Well, let's see, we've ended, of course, Parfum is such an amazing one. I talk about it with Carbone, a piece he wrote for the coal merchant in the winter of 1917. So at the very end of Parfum, let's see, let me get into it. Da-dum. Well, we've ended with A major here. Isn't that interesting? And then going into the Hills of Anacapri, what do we do from A major? We go back to B this time. So we've gone from the B flat to the A and then up to B for the Hills of Anacapri. And then we have this, these clusters. So, there is some thought that goes into how these things relate. We try to do this as pianists. If we pick and choose pieces from a composer, we'll think about how they relate. Like in Chopin, we might think about that. There's a mazurka that ends. So I like to then start the ballade, as if it's an abbreviation between the pieces. And so Debussy clearly thought about this in the cycle. So here we have it. The Wind on the Plain, played in Wetzikon on the stage of the Waldorf School.